Was the Great Wall of China actually built by the Tartarians? This is a question that has come up time and time again. On today's episode, I'm going to explain where this theory came from, then discuss the official narrative, and allow you to judge for yourself. The theory states that the Tartarians were the true constructors of the Great Wall, and not the Chinese. The official narrative claims the wall was built to stop the barbarous Mongol invaders, but theorists say that China has taken credit for the vast construct originally designed to keep them out. They point to images of the wall which appear to show arrow slits and battlements pointing towards China. There are also other depictions which would appear to show the openings on the north side facing Tartary. Could this be evidence that the Great Wall was in fact built by the Tartarians and not the Chinese? Well, I wanted to find out more. So, I started to search for the first person to make this claim. A quick perusal of the Internet Archive shows the theory became popular on TikTok in the past few years, and although many YouTubers have shied away from discussing the topic directly, there have been a few. I managed to track the theory down in a book called One World Tartarians, which was released in 2022, where it becomes clear that the origins of this conspiracy lay in the hands of Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko. If you aren't familiar with Fomenko's work, he's a professor at Moscow State University who further developed and expanded upon theories put forward by Soviet writer Nikolai Morozov. Essentially, Fomenko claimed he found discrepancies in chronological dating, which meant that everything recorded as happening before 1100 AD had been fabricated by Jesuits in the 16 to 1700s. He also claims the Tartarian or Mongolian Empire was actually the Great Russian Empire, which controlled the world until Russia was taken over by the European Romanovs. At this point, history was falsified to remove mentions of this Great Russian Empire. However, critics within the Tartaria community suggest Fomenko has ulterior motives, with his theory being incredibly Rus-centric and promoting Russian nationalism. The idea of Russia being the Mongols removes their centuries of subjugation to the Tatar yoke. It also removes a long-standing history of Russian aggressions against the indigenous people and rewrites a story of invasion and poverty into one of unity and prosperity. So, we will now examine Fomenko's specific claims about the Great Wall. In Volume 5 of his New Chronology, he quotes Morozov as saying, "The idea that the building of the famous Chinese wall with a height of 6 to 7 meters and a thickness of 3, stretching for 3,000 kilometers, began in 246 BC and was only finished after 1,866 years by 1620 AD is ridiculous." He's saying the idea of starting a defensive structure which will not be completed for 2,000 years is nonsensical. Fomenko further explains the wall is too thick for defending against arrows and spears, with the thickness suggesting it was built to defend against cannons. This would place its construction in the 15th to 16th century. This was further backed up by the seeming lack of mentions of the wall before this period. For example, Marco Polo never reported seeing such a structure when he traveled to China between 1271 and 1295 AD. Professor Fomenko also notes how some people, such as Arab historian Abul Fida, seemingly describe the wall as the Wall of Gog and Magog. Fomenko then quotes Russian historian Lev Gumilev as saying, "The wall stretches for 4,000 kilometers. Its height reached 10 meters, with watchtowers every 60 to 100 meters. But when the works were finished, as it turned out, that all the armed forces of China were not sufficient to organize effective defense on the wall. If you put a small detachment on each tower, it will be destroyed before the neighbors give help." Fomenko highlights this fact and asks why the Chinese did not think about this before building the wall. He then goes on to offer his own hypothesis. He suggests that the Great Wall was constructed as a simple border between the Russian and Chinese empires in the 17th century. In this hypothesis, Russia already owns all the land which was known as Chinese Tartary, and had done for many years. He also says it owned China until around the 1600s, when the introduction of the Romanovs saw China cede from the empire. After some years of bickering, the Chinese and Russian empires finally put down their borders on paper, and to commemorate the moment, the Chinese built a wall along the established perimeter. The wall was merely ceremonious. As discussed before, it couldn't be feasibly defended. Therefore, it stood to act as a monument to the agreement and to prevent further disputes. He also says it's possible that the Chinese constructed the wall in fear of the Romanovs, who had taken over the Russian Empire, although this would contradict the points he'd previously made about the wall being undefendable. To back his Great Border Wall theory up, Fomenko shows a series of maps from the 1600s which show the Great Wall of China. He says that the Great Wall did not appear on maps before this period. Coupled with the fact Marco Polo did not record seeing the wall in 1290, this would also suggest it hadn't been constructed until the 1600s. He also points at how the Great Wall seems to perfectly follow the border of China. How is it possible that the ancient Chinese in 200 BC knew exactly where the modern border of China would be? To offer more evidence, Fomenko points to the Treaty of Achinsk, signed in 1689 between Russia and China, which formally identified each other's borders. Fomenko quotes this section from Kharbarov's notes. The emperor began his implementation of his plan of squeezing Russians from the Amur River. By building a chain of fortifications, the emperor in 1684 sent to the Amur a Manchu army. Fomenko says these fortifications are clearly describing the Great Wall of China. Except they're not. A simple look at the location of the Amur River about 700 miles away from the Great Wall will immediately make you question this narrative. By Fomenko's logic, the Amur River would be well into Russian territory, and therefore it doesn't make sense why the emperor was sending an army to clear out the Russians. If we look at this map, we can see the red line, showing where the 1689 treaty established the real border. In the years building up to this treaty, the Russians had slowly been moving south from Yakutsk and had penetrated as far into Manchuria as the Amur River. The Emperor of China, a Manchurian Tatar who had taken over China in 1644, sent an army to repel them. After doing so, they built fortifications along the Amur River to prevent further attacks. At the time, the Russians lacked the infrastructure to move large amounts of troops and supplies across Siberia, and as a result, the Manchus had them heavily outmanned and outgunned. The Russians were tied up fighting the Mongols around Lake Baikal, and the Manchus were also busy trying to subdue the various nations of Chinese Tartary to establish their empire. In 1689, they signed the Achinsk Treaty, which officially established the borders between the two empires, and whilst both sides were unhappy with the terms of the agreement, it put an end to hostilities. These borders remained for 200 years until the fall of the Tatar dynasty at the end of the Opium Wars, when Russia finally took the northern bank of the Amur back, where they evicted the locals and Russified the cities. It wouldn't make any historical or geographical sense if the fortifications mentioned being built on the Amur River were in fact referring to the Great Wall of China. This is an example of how Fomenko is rewriting Russian invasions. He's moved the border 700 miles south and gifted Russia the entire territory of Mongolia and Manchuria. Earlier we mentioned Morozov's claims that a wall taking 2,000 years to build is ridiculous, and how the wall seems to appear on maps starting in the 1600s. Firstly, he's correct. A defensive structure taking so long to build would be futile, and this is where you might accuse Morozov and Fomenko of being disingenuous. You see, official history doesn't actually claim the wall to be that old. It's more tourist propaganda. If we briefly examine the history of the wall, we'll learn it was constructed by the Qin Dynasty, the first dynasty of Imperial China in around 200 BC. They built it to stop the frequent incursions of the Xiongnu, the ancestors of the Huns, Turks, Mongols, and Tatars. The only problem is, it wasn't the same wall, and it wasn't even the first. The earliest iterations of these barriers were built by independent Chinese nations who were warring for control from around the 5th century BC. There are most likely even older walls that we haven't found yet or have been completely destroyed. Looking at this map, all the yellow lines are barriers constructed by these various warring nations. When historians claim the Great Wall is almost 3,000 years old, it's because they are talking about these earliest iterations. The lighter orange line is the wall built by the Qin Dynasty. They are attributed as being the original builders of the Great Wall, as it was the first barrier built by a unified China, rather than independent states. So in that sense, we can say the Great Wall is 2,200 years old, but that's still not technically correct. We can see that for about 400 years after the Qin Dynasty, the Han Dynasty went about building or rebuilding the walls shown here as the darker orange lines. China then separated once more into warring nations, and we can see sections built by the Northern Wei, the Northern Qi, and the Sui Dynasty, northwest of Beijing. Nothing happened for 400 years until the rise of the Khitan-Lao dynasty, who invaded from Manchuria, which at the time was named Kitay or Cathay. Curiously, this is why the word for China in Russian is Kitay, because when they first learned of China, it was ruled by the Khitans, and as a result, they named it after them. Which brings up a curiosity. In 1533, in Moscow, the Russians invited Italian architect Petrok Fryazan to build them a large defensive wall around the city. This wall they named Kitty-Gorod, which translates to China City, or perhaps more accurately, Khitan City. Why would the Russians hire an Italian architect to build them a wall called China City? Anyway, back to the map, and you can see the Lao, who are the Khitans, and the following Jin dynasty constructed their walls on the borders of Manchuria and Mongolia, showing the increased size of their territory, which are represented by the light purple lines on the map. Of course, the walls failed, and the Jin fell to the Mongol Empire in 1237, with China remaining under Tatar control until 1368, with the rise of the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty began construction on a new wall, depicted on the map in dark purple, with this wall intended to prevent further incursions by the Mongols. This is the wall we know today, constructed between 1368 and 1644 by the Ming Dynasty, 1644 of course being when the Manchu Tatars took over China, and hence further construction on the wall subsided. After Manchus took control, the Chinese borders were far beyond the Great Wall, and as such, the wall was no longer necessary and no further work was seemingly done on it until the 1950s, when they performed restoration work. Fomenko was technically correct. The wall we see today is at most about 600 years old, but I'm pretty sure he will have already known this, and it's not exactly secret information. Therefore, his earlier arguments now seem disingenuous. Fomenko isn't definitive with a date for construction, but he suggests between 1620 to 1690 as the limits for when it was built. He also showed us a series of maps to confirm the Great Wall appears in the 1600s. The earliest I could find is from 1584, which is 100 years before the Treaty of Achinsk. He asks, why did the Great Wall not appear before this? Furthermore, why did visitors such as Marco Polo not describe the wall? If we compare the sections of the Ming Dynasty wall with the sections built long before, we'll see an obvious difference. One is a magnificently constructed piece of masonry, and the other is essentially a dirt mound. These walls were not made of masonry, but just tightly packed dirt with rocks. So, this could explain why Marco Polo didn't mention it, because it wasn't even a wall, and the most recent constructions had been on the Manchu and Mongolian borders by the Lao and Jin dynasties, many miles away. Before that, the most recent constructions were in 400 AD, and that means 800 years had passed by the time Marco Polo was in the area, meaning these walls would have most likely heavily degraded. Also, Fomenko suggested the reason that Marco Polo didn't mention the wall is because it didn't exist yet, but he also tells us that Abul-Fida called it the Wall of Gog and Magog. Abul-Fida visited China around 30 years after Marco Polo, which would imply the wall must have been there, just Marco didn't see it. One explanation is that Abul-Fida was seeing one of the walls built by the Jin or Lao dynasty in Manchuria or Mongolia. This would seemingly be backed up by the fact that Magog was used as a word for Mongol in the Middle Ages. Therefore, a wall of Gog and Magog would be a wall of Mongolia. This is probably referring to the wall built by the Jin dynasty to keep the Mongol Empire out. Marco Polo didn't travel to these areas, and as a result, he never saw the Jin Wall. As we mentioned, the wall we see today was constructed by the Ming Dynasty after they broke free from the Mongols in 1368. Therefore, the wall appearing on a 1584 map is probably what we'd expect. That gives about 200 years for the wall to be constructed, for someone to visit and record seeing it, and then take that information back with them to create the map. Fomenko also said the wall was built as a border between the Russian and Chinese empires, and that these maps were evidence of that. Firstly, one of the maps he provides as evidence in his book, if you look closely, by the wall in Latin it reads, "A wall of 400 leagues built by the king of China between the crags of the mountains against the incursions of the Tatars." And if we look at an English version of the map, we can see again the same thing, a wall of 400 leagues built between the bottoms of the mountains by the king of China against the incursions of the Tatars. Now, I'm sure Fomenko will claim this is some kind of falsification, but I'm afraid you can't have it both ways. You can't use the map as evidence to provide your point and then claim the map has been tampered with when it shatters your narrative. Secondly, he asked how the ancient builders in 200 BC would be able to construct a wall which perfectly matched the borders of China 1800 years later. Well, as we saw earlier, they didn't. So, this point is just wrong. This map from earlier clearly shows the position of the Ming Wall, the sections where the tourists view, and the various positions of the older ones, which, like I said, were not masonry, but were made of compacted dirt and rocks. Now that we've dealt with Fomenko's Russian side of the theory, let's go back to the original claims that the wall was Tartarian. At this point, I decided to ask an expert to provide the official explanation because they know it better than me, and you can decide for yourself whether it's accurate. The expert says, the idea that the arrow slits or battlements are only facing China is incorrect. If you use Google Earth to zoom into some of the sections of the wall, you can see that the crenellations face north. In regards to some of the defensive elements facing south, the wall was intended to make it difficult for invading armies to get in and also to get back out. The invaders would usually form raiding parties and rush into Chinese lands, attempting to pillage and steal, and the wall was meant to subvert such practices. If the attackers broke through, the wall's defenders would need to be able to engage the invaders on both sides of the barrier. It also acted as a signaling system which allowed for the fast relay of information regarding the movements of enemy troops. It was never intended to defend the whole wall. Watchtowers would spot an invading army approaching, and signal flares would allow the Chinese to gather at the correct section of the wall to repel the attack. So that's the official explanation for why the wall was in fact Chinese and was built to stop Tartar invaders and not the other way round. There are people who still suggest the walls were modified in the 1900s during repair work to remove some of these things and make it look more Chinese and make it appear like it was facing north, but that's up to you if you want to believe that. So what do you think? Was the Great Wall built by Tartarians to prevent Chinese invaders? Was it, like Professor Fomenko suggests, a simple border wall between the Great Mongolian Russian Empire and the Chinese constructed in the 1600s? Or was it simply the Great Wall of China, built by the Ming Dynasty to prevent the incursions of invaders? Let me know in the comments below. So, thank you for watching this episode. I'm really curious to hear everyone's opinions, no matter which side you believe. If you believe it's the Great Wall of Tartaria, if you believe it's the Great Wall of China, or if you think it's a border between Fomenko's giant Russian Empire. I want to hear about it down in the comments below. And a bigger thank you to all my supporters. You guys really help me out, and I can't thank you enough. If you'd like to support the channel, then there's a few ways you can do so. We've got Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, YouTube, channel memberships. If you join any 3 of those, then you get into the private Discord where we talk all day and post research and stuff, so it's quite fun in there. If that's something you're into, make sure you check it out. And we even have some merch available. I'm not really a merch person, but we have hoodies and stuff with my logo on. Other than that, you can follow me on Instagram if you're an Instagrammer, or we even have a Reddit. So if you have a Reddit, make sure you go and join the Reddit. At the moment, it's the subreddit is very small, less than 100 members, but hopefully in the future we'll have a lot more people posting their own research, posting their own ideas, and generate a bit of a community there. So that's completely free for you to go and join. Obviously, it's a public subreddit where you can go right now and post your theories and try and talk to other ancient historians. Other than that, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Ancient Historia.